Anita McBride, when she graduated college, decided to take a volunteer position working for the Reagan campaign. It was 1980. I think you all know he won. And she says it's much better to be on the winning side. 4 years later, she gave up her job to take another unpaid position for the re-elect Reagan campaign. And that one really paid off because the week after the election, she got hired in the White House. Now, she started in the basement reading mail, but over 20 years in the White House, she worked her way up to chief of staff for Laura Bush. So she's got incredible credentials. I'll let you hear a little bit more about her after I introduce the other person. Joining her is Doug Miller, and when he's not busy interviewing all these people for the Writers Series and the Writers Festival, he's at his other job. He sits on the appellate court bench in the city of Riverside as a justice. And when he's at home, he gets to call me his first lady. So please welcome Anita McBride and Doug Miller.
Debbie, that is great. What a great intro. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Oh my gosh, what a crowd. This is awesome. I don't think I've ever been in a room of 400 people that cheer when you tell them it's 95 degrees outside. That's amazing.
That's because they were here 2 weeks ago and
Yes,
it was 114.
Yeah, cold front.
I told you this at lunch, so it's not a surprise to you. But when, and I have to say this, and quite frankly, it's a little bit embarrassing. But when Jamie, picks great books, when he asked me to do the interview for this, I wasn't quite so sure if it was something that I would be interested in. But as usual, within 50 pages, I turned to Debbie and I said, I'm hooked. Why didn't I learn these things? So tell us why a book on the First Lady.
That took 50 pages. I was hoping you'd say 5. Well, I was just as honored and just as surprised and really flattered when I got an email from Jamie asking me to, and the book was just out at that point. This version of the book was just out, but it started, as we talked about, as a textbook. And I was telling a few people in the group here as we were coming in that in August of 2023, myself and my co-authors, because there's 3 of us that did this book, published the first ever textbook on the topic of First Ladies, college level, undergraduate level. And we tested this book out in about 5 or 6 different universities around the country. And the response was the same as you just said, by male and female students. Why did we never learn this before? We were filling a gap in academic literature that underscored the fact that when we study history, we were not studying the contributions of these women. So that's how it started. An academic publisher here in California, in San Diego, Cognella, had contacted one of my co-authors who had written books for them before. She's a retired college professor, and suggested this. And she said yes, she would do it, but she had 2 people she'd like to do it with, and I was lucky to be one of them.
So why do you think it's important?
Because I think that how can we talk about inclusive history in our country, which we talk about all the time, and not include the stories of these women and the contributions that they have made to the founding of our nation, to the social movements of our nation, in both our politics, our policy, our global diplomacy. These women are the partners to the presidency. There's no statutory authority for their job, no position description, no salary, yet it's an automatic, powerful platform the minute the president takes the oath of office. And so as you know, because you've read the book beyond the 50 pages, thank you very much, on the way that we structured this to show the contributions in so many facets of society.
So you take a unique approach, because again, when Jamie handed it to me, I thought it was going to be a biography of one person after another for 250 years plus. But the book is written differently. Explain how you came up with that and why.
So we took an approach of two different ways to structure this book. One, and we do cover everyone, from Martha Washington to Jill Biden, and we cover the wives of the presidents, those who actually served alongside the president, not because some of our presidents were widowers, one was never married, so we don't cover those. That could be a whole nother book. But we decided to look at two different things: the factors that made them successful in their jobs or made it difficult for them to do their jobs, those factors being issues that they are interested in. They come to the position with a passion, something that they want to accomplish. Additionally, what support do they get from the president and the structure around the president, including his advisors? Those are two contributing factors that are an overlay for us in the book. The other overlay, which is really important, is what is happening in our country in the women's movement. What is the status of women from the founding of our country to today? And how did that factor either make it possible for them to be successful, or they pushed up against it, or not?
So I'm going to take a break from this
Sure.
book because I want to ask you about this one.
I know.
This is a children's book
Yes.
called First Ladies Make History, written by Anita McBride, and I believe your daughter.
My
correct?
daughter, this is her second book. She is a student at Texas Christian University as a senior. She's graduating in May and become an elementary school teacher. She's in the 4th grade now. But so I'm on the board of the White House Historical Association. And
Tell us what that is.
Okay, so the White House Historical Association actually is a legacy of an American First Lady. It was founded by Jackie Kennedy in 1961 as a 31-year-old First Lady. She came in, she remembered coming to the White House as an 11-year-old child, touring the rooms with her mother and coming away very disappointed that there was no guidebook. There was no understanding of what you were seeing room to room, the art, the furniture that was there. So 20 years later, she's First Lady of the United States, and she does something about it. She founds the White House Historical Association to be the private funding arm to really make the White House the museum quality that it should be, with the collections that are authentic to the building, with the best of American art and decorative arts she felt should be in the White House. That's one function of the White House Historical Association. The other function is its education mission, and publications are a part of that. So a few years, in fact, one of the first things she did as First Lady was produce the guidebook that she sold for $1 when you come through well, she didn't, but it got sold for $1. And it raised a lot of money because Americans now had something they could learn about the White House. That book, the guidebook, is in its 34th printing. We are still printing that book and continually updating it, of course, as the White House and the occupants
And
change.
I know we're jumping way ahead,
Yes.
but I
Yes.
remember as a kid
Yes.
watching the TV show.
Oh, yes.
Watched by 40 million people.
Yes.
She won an
more.
Emmy.
Even more. That's right. She won an Emmy. This is Valentine's Day, 1962. Mrs. Kennedy does a walk and talk with CBS News, Charles Collingwood, room by room of the White House. And without a note in front of her, and in that very enticing, breathless voice of hers, she opens up the White House to everyone's living room. I think it was over 70 million people watched and saw the White House really for the first time. She encouraged them to really love their history, understand the history that has taken place here, trying to explain what she was trying to do, because this was something her husband and his advisors did not want her to take up the cause of preservation. They felt it was elitist, that nobody could connect with it, but she disregarded all of that, takes on this initiative, raises a lot of money, brings back extraordinary pieces of work and collection to the White House, and then connects the American people to it. And so part of it, again, the guidebook was the first of the publications and part of the education mission. And we, to this day, publish award-winning books on every facet of the White House History Journal, which is a quarterly magazine, which is extraordinary. And then a few years ago, the president of our organization presented to the board that they were getting commentary, if not complaints, by retail customers that we had no children's books. So we agreed to do a series of children's books. This one is now the 9th in the series, but the first one, the only one on First Ladies. All the other are about the
And
presidents.
when does it come
This
out?
comes out
And how can they
December
buy it?
3rd. This is an advance copy that I brought for Jamie. My daughter Gigi and I just did a little press preview on it last week, and we know it's going to be quite popular. I had a lot of material here that we used, but it was interesting doing this with my daughter, who's studying to be a teacher, who really tempered the use of the language I was trying to introduce, to really understand how children learn, how they become literate, and how illustrations and words help them develop language. So we had fun doing it together. Thank you for raising it. Thank you, Jamie.
So we all know that the Constitution defines the role of the president, head of the government, head of the state.
Right.
We all know there's nothing in there about the First Lady. So I love how your book starts, because it starts with the first three presidents' wives, and I called them that, as you know, on purpose, and we'll get to that
That's
in a
right.
second. Their names we all know: Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison. So tell us about those three and how they set such important precedents for the president's wives.
Yes, exactly. They deserve to have their own chapter to help set the tone of what this was like, establishing a new nation, a new form of government that never existed before. Now, George Washington knew immediately when he became president it was a two-person job, head of state and head of government, as you mentioned. Lucky for him, Martha Washington was very adept at the social skills that are really necessary for the head of state role, the ceremonial role. Of course, she had been entertaining people at Mount Vernon for years. She was a genteel, Southern lady of her time. So she had the burden of setting precedent for this role. But George Washington received her on the shores of Trenton, New Jersey, before bringing her over to New York, our first capital, in a way that was with great fanfare to set the tone for the new, American citizens, that her role in supporting him as a partner was very important. Now, she's handed a list of responsibilities to
That they
take
made up.
on, that they made up, that his advisors now sort of made up. And one of the things that was she was instructed to do was that she could receive people in their home in New York, but could not really make the social calls and visits to other people's homes when she was invited, to not show favoritism to one group or another. We were still, understanding, there were still a lot of factions that existed, of course, as our nation's trying to develop. So she had to set a precedent of how to be ceremonial enough, formal enough, but still accessible to people of the republic, of this new nation.
And she
also
was even astute enough
oh yeah, on the
to
fashion.
know what kind of clothes to wear and not what to wear.
She was one of our nation's first early influencers. She only would wear clothes made in America, so she was not going to buy. Yes, exactly. Isn't that great? And so there was a new sort of publication, a magazine that was being newly produced, published for women, believe it or not. Here, women had no rights in our Constitution, yet these things were sort of going on. And she was asked if they could do a sketch of her in some of these, American fashions, and she said no, only because a woman of her time believed you're in the paper only 3 times in your life: when you're born, when you're married, and when you die. So she did not want to be featured, yet it was known she was supporting this. Now, Abigail Adams, who really learned at the foot of Martha Washington, of course, as our nation's first second lady, was a little different than Martha. She had difficulty sort of holding back her opinions, holding her tongue. But yet the relationship between the two of them was one of great deference and great respect. And Abigail, really of all of the figures in our history, this is really a woman who endured great suffering, great separation for 10 years at a time when her husband was trying to raise money for the fight for our independence, going to foreign nations, begging for money. She is at home in Massachusetts trying to manage their family farm, raise these children on her own, witnesses the Battle of Bunker Hill, was really the eyes and ears of our revolution. Very important guidance and information. The treasure trove of correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams is incredible, completely different than Martha Washington, who really burned all of her correspondence between her and her husband. There's really only a handful of letters that have survived. But
Can I? So
sure.
you have a great story about Abigail.
Yes.
And you analogize it to her doing the first tweet. So tell us about that.
So Abigail Adams, who's so devoted to our nation, so devoted to her husband, was intolerant of any criticisms of him. So she would write anonymously stories about how great he was as a president, how many good things he was doing for the country, and she would have them planted by friends or other family members, never with her name on it. In newspapers, yeah, exactly. She found it very hard to hold back her tongue, but she was his most important confidant. No doubt about it, an important advisor. She was criticized in the way she was called as Mrs. President, and not in a good way. It was because it was widely believed she was too influential.
So tell us a little bit about Dolly.
Oh, Dolly Madison, the great unifier in our nation. She really had this opportunity to serve in the White House twice, really, because Thomas Jefferson, of course, was a widower, and his daughter Martha served the first couple of years as de facto First Lady, but then she had children, the first to have a child born in the White House. She moves back to Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson needed a social hostess. So Dolly, whose wife of James Madison was Secretary of State at the time, she fulfills this role beautifully. And then becomes First Lady herself, of course, when James Madison becomes president. And she was so politically astute. And in fact, her husband really valued her political astuteness even more than he did her social skills. She knew how to bring all sides together, including opposing sides, at all of the events that she hosted. She hosted these amazing parties with great alcoholic beverages that people really loved, and the rooms were so packed. They were called squeezes because you literally had to squeeze in the room, and she wore very flamboyant colored clothes, very low décolleté. She wore a big plume and turban on her head so that everybody in the room, no matter where they were, could see her, and they would come to her. She would work the room, garnered valuable pieces of information that were really important to her husband. So these three women, very, different, but really helped to set the tone for the nation.
And she also did something very important. Mm-hmm. We forget during the War of 1812, the White House was destroyed.
That's right.
And she saved
the portrait. She directed the slaves who were working in the White House, because of course our first 11 first families were slaveholders, except for the Adams. The John and Abigail Adams paid their African American servants at their farm in Braintree, and also paid for their education. Really remarkable. One last thing I'll just say about Abigail Adams: she could not reconcile how a nation founded on freedom could hold people in human bondage, and so, which was really, again, so far ahead of her time. But Dolly, during the War of 1812, this is August 1814, and her husband is out surveying the troops in Bladensburg, Maryland, and the British troops are advancing on Washington. They burned the Capitol, they burned the White House, and what she instructed her slave to cut out the portrait of George Washington, to roll it up, take it to safety, as well as documents that were in the house. I mean, this was the president's office and home. So in a way, she was our nation's first archivist, but she was astute enough to know if that portrait of George Washington was captured and brought back to London, paraded in the streets of Britain, that they had destroyed this new nation. She just wasn't going to have that.
So do you see why it took only 50 pages? This is the first part of the book. And in fact, if I had read nothing else, it would have been worth it, because they were three amazing people. And
Yes.
I hate to spend too
Thank
much
you.
time on
But
Abigail.
it sets the tone, right?
Yeah. But on Abigail, she really was ahead of her time on women's rights and education for women. So
That's where we get the title of the book, Remember the First Ladies, because she admonished her husband when he was writing the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1775, to remember the ladies, be kinder to them than your ancestors. If not, we will foment a rebellion. I mean, she was really strong. There is may I say one criticism of her, though? Because she was so intolerant of criticism of her husband, she really pushed him to sign, which was really a stain in the Adams of the Alien and Sedition Acts that made it a criminal offense to criticize the president. You could be imprisoned and jailed. I mean, you just can't imagine that.
So we kind of take it for granted, because for our era and our generation, they're first ladies.
Yes.
But they weren't always known as the first lady.
Right.
Tell us about that transition.
Right. Well, the first, so as we mentioned, Mrs. Washington, well, she was known as Mrs. Washington or Lady Washington. Abigail Adams was kind of criticized for being Mrs. President. But the term First Lady was first introduced in 1849 when President Zachary Taylor eulogized Dolly Madison at her funeral in Washington, which was a state event. The entire city of Washington shut down. The Congress attended, the House and Senate members of our Congress attended. The federal government was closed down. Thousands of people came to the funeral of Dolly Madison. That's how beloved that she was. Because, of course, after she left the White House and she and President Madison moved back to Montpelier after he died, she moved back to Washington. She became really the grande dame of the city of Washington. It also helped to mentor other first ladies. But President Taylor eulogizes her and calls her the first lady of the land. So the term starts to be introduced, but it really is not a commonplace until about 1890 with Caroline Harrison, as First Lady Caroline Harrison. But a number of first ladies did not like the term, like Jacqueline Kennedy, even in the 60s, refused to be called First Lady. She wanted to be called Mrs. Kennedy. She thought the term First Lady sounded like a saddle horse, and she did not want to be called that.
So I think I told you at lunch I could have done a lightning round, because there's so many interesting facts we could do one after another. But what was interesting to me, and which I guess I knew at some time but had forgotten, or maybe I didn't know, not all the presidents were married.
Right.
Some even became widowers during their presidency. So what did they do? Because as you talk about, the role started kind of ceremonial. They were to be the hostess and do the ceremonies and the state visits. So what did those presidents do?
In those cases where presidents were either widowed, or we had, one that was unmarried, President Buchanan, never married, and his niece, Harriet Lane, served as the de facto First Lady, beloved in Washington, well-known, also very benevolent. Actually, she also had served alongside him when he served as ambassador to the court of St. James. She, as his niece, was the de facto, wife of the diplomat. So she was very skilled. So that's one case where throughout his entire presidency, the same person served, a family member. But other presidents, like President Van Buren, who was widowed before he became president, his daughter-in-law, Abigail Van Buren, served as First Lady. Incidentally, is the only portrait of a non-spouse of First Lady that's hanging in the collection of First Lady portraits at the White House. It's in the Red Room, and it's a beautiful portrait. But other family members would serve. And in fact, you had even, cases like President Kennedy with Jacqueline Kennedy as First Lady. There was definitely certain things she was not going to want to do. If she wanted to go to Middleburg and ride her horses, she was going to take that time off. If she was going to go travel abroad with her sister or whatever it might be. So in that case, Mrs. Johnson, wife of the vice president, supported President Kennedy. Mrs. Rose Kennedy did. President Kennedy's sisters filled in. So there are family members who stepped up to help.
So I want to go back to Dolly for a second.
Yes.
Because she outlived her husband, the president,
Yes.
by many
Yes.
years.
Yes.
And died penniless. So did she not have a pension? I mean,
Right.
tell us about that, how that
Right.
developed.
The concept of a pension for a presidential spouse really did not happen until Mary Lincoln fought for it. And she fought the Congress for it because now she was the widow of an assassinated president. And, she had so many struggles. I mean, one of the more maligned of our first ladies who suffered greatly for our nation. But she appealed to the Congress. It was eventually approved. And so first ladies who are widowed, if the former president dies, they get a pension now. But in the time of Dolly Madison, they didn't. And she really was relied on the benevolence of many of her friends and prominent people in Washington to really give her, maintain her in the lifestyle that she was used to. It was tough.
You write in the book, you say, quote, "First ladies are mirrors of their times and leader," end of quote. What do you mean by that?
Well, they are a reflection of, again, as we said earlier, what is the status of women in our country while they are serving. They are mirrors of that time, yet they have an opportunity with this platform to push the nation forward. And we know and act as leaders, and we know through, chapters are in the book where we examine social movements going on in the country, labor movement, women's movements, where they have played a role. Nellie Taft, a woman you don't hear very much about, but really pushed for better working conditions for women in the workforce, starting with the federal government. So again, showing leadership, even though there was no real protections for women at that time, and they still didn't have the right to vote.
So tell us a little bit about the cultural aspects of women's suffrage, civil rights, and slavery. How did the first ladies impact
Engage.
those?
That's actually was the first chapter that we had for the book, because it was on civil rights, First Ladies and Civil Rights, because it was an article that the three of us who wrote this book had written for CNN.com, and this was in the summer of 2020 after the George Floyd, murder in Minnesota. And so we wrote an article about some examples of the better angels of our times and how First Ladies have played a leadership role in civil rights. So that, and again, we have First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. You think about her and the role that she played in pushing for human rights and for civil rights. Lady Bird Johnson in the 60s, when her husband signs the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and it was deeply unpopular in the South, where, of course, they were from. He knew he would lose the South for the Democratic Party for years to come because of it. So he's running for election in 1964, his first full term, because, of course, he had fulfilled the term of President Kennedy in 63. So Lady Bird Johnson campaigns through the South, a 9-state visit that she started in Alexandria, Virginia, ended up in New Orleans, Louisiana, went through 9 states and went to the small towns of the South, not the big cities, campaigning for him, but also promoting and supporting her husband's legislation of the Civil Rights Act, because she felt as a Southern woman it would be easier for her to do this than for him, and she was right. I mean, the trip was deemed too dangerous for President Johnson to do, and they sent a train 15 minutes ahead of her at each stop because of bomb threats. It was just such a courageous act for her to do that. So that's a really illustrative example of first ladies and civil rights. And in the chapter on this, we uphold modern struggles for civil rights, like education and literacy. That is, we have some of our modern first ladies, like Barbara Bush and Laura Bush, really argued that that is a civil right, and the things that they have supported and promoted, legacies that they have left behind on those topics. But there's, many examples through our history. Ellen Wilson, we don't think about her very much. She was the first wife of President Woodrow Wilson. She campaigned to have the slums of Washington, D.C. eradicated, and just felt that the conditions that immigrants and African Americans were living in were not right. And on her deathbed, the Congress passed that legislation in her honor, but typical of Congress, they authorized it but didn't appropriate the money.
We went to New York and saw the Broadway play Suffs.
Oh, sure.
And
sure.
it talks
That
about
Hillary
in there
Clinton.
about the president, the
yes.
president's wife,
Yes.
and I think, tell us who the first lady was who voted for her husband?
Florence Harding, that's right, because you asked about the women's movement too, in addition to civil rights. Yes, this was, and some of our first ladies, had a complex relationship with this concept of women having the right to vote, or being active campaigners, or having a very visible voice in the public square. And that's something we try to overlay of our book too, how we went from women having no rights at all to slowly gaining their voice in the public square, to becoming political actors of their own, like Hillary Clinton, who is the only first lady actually be elected to public office and run for president of the United States. But the women's movement, yes, very complex for many of them, but Florence Harding did support the women's right to vote. She was the first lady to cast a vote, and it was for her husband, obviously, Warren Harding, who was running. Some first ladies who, just, again, did not feel women should be, they knew how influential they were behind the scenes, but were uncomfortable supporting them being politically active, because there were periods of time in our country that was just deemed, inappropriate or too rough and tumble a way of life for women to be in politics.
So kind of want to jump ahead, when did the role of the first lady truly begin to change and become more of a defined role?
Well, but part of it starts with Edith Roosevelt, who was the first lady to actually have a professional staff member. That made a big change. Prior to that, it was just household staff, or slaves in our early first families, who supported the first lady in the home. There really weren't initiatives. But Mrs. Roosevelt hired the first professional staff member, and it was a social secretary, because she moves into the White House with 5 rambunctious children, and then the older, stepdaughter, who had been the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt and his first wife, who died. And so she's also besieged by all of this interest from the press about her family, about these kids, what they were doing in the White House. So she hired a social secretary to help manage all the social obligations, plus also feed pieces of info or pictures to the press to sort of take the pressure off her. So that's when things really began to change. But believe it or not, there was not an official office of the First Lady with its own budget until Rosalind Carter. And which is, we're talking now 1978, with the establishment of the White House Personnel Authorization Act, which actually gave a defined budget to office of the First Lady. Prior to that, some of our, like Lou Hoover was the First Lady. She had 3 staff members, paid for them all out of her own pocket. And her office was her bedroom. That's where all her papers were, strewn across her bed. Most First Ladies worked out of the little dressing room up on the 2nd floor of the White House. But Rosalind Carter, who had come to Washington after having been First Lady of Georgia, she was chair of the Mental Health Commission in the state of Georgia. She was fully planning on being very engaged in her husband's administration. In fact, in both the memoirs of both Carters, they write about how in their long marriage, this was one of the only times that they fought, when she pushed for more staff and he did not want to do it because he campaigned on cutting the size of the White House staff. And now here comes Rosalind saying, I can't do all this that you want me to do if I don't have people. And she was the first person to actually put her office in the East Wing of the White House so she could work alongside her staff.
So are there any first ladies who you believe were judged improperly or overlooked?
Well, certainly Mary Lincoln was judged improperly and takes a big, hit on a lot of, some self-inflicted. I mean, when they came into the White House was in bad shape. And she already knew that he was being criticized as someone who really was not sophisticated enough to be president. So she wanted to show the White House in the status and the look that she felt it should be. And so she spent a 4-year congressional appropriation in 4 months. This is now, the Civil War is just starting. I mean, talk about not being able to read the room. This was a problem. And so he's so embarrassed. President Lincoln is so embarrassed by this. And so, but again, she was trying to have Americans have pride in the White House. Now, that didn't mean that everybody that got invited to their parties didn't come. They loved Mrs. Lincoln's parties, so she was unfairly criticized for that. She also, during the Civil War, 3 of her relatives fought for the Confederacy, so she wasn't trusted by either side, here where her husband is trying to preserve the Union. She loses a son in the White House. She's completely devastated by that. Her husband's assassinated, in front of her. Her oldest son later puts her in a mental and has her institutionalized. She has to claw her way back to have a livelihood, fights the Congress for a pension, and really sacrificed and endured a lot. So she's misjudged by history terribly. Pat Nixon, one of your first ladies here in the state of California, remarkable first lady in the contributions that she made. In fact, so the most traveled first lady in history, 81 countries. She was the only first lady to be given the title personal representative of the president when she traveled overseas. Other first ladies, of course, go as, an advocate for their husband, go as a diplomat for us. But really, this was a formal title that was bestowed to her. Her contributions to the White House are unmatched, really. We think of Jacqueline Kennedy, and we should, as having, instituted this process of protecting our White House, making it a museum, and protecting the collections. But under Mrs. Nixon, more was acquired to the White House collection. Mrs. Nixon was the one who lit the White House at night so Americans could see it. Mrs. Nixon, long before the Americans with Disabilities Act, had ramps installed in the White House for the disabled who come on tours that they could see it. She instituted tours for the blind. She instituted tours at night so that working women who were now coming into the workforce can see the White House. The White House garden tours that are going on were established under Mrs. Nixon. She really, and in fact, one thing that happened in Washington today, I don't know if you're following any of this, but at Dulles Airport today, a specially outfitted FedEx Boeing jet arrived with the pandas. Back to the National Zoo. It was Mrs. Nixon who first made that happen in the 70s after their trip to China. I mean, there's just so many ways that she contributed to White House life. And people were her project, she would say. I mean, she just a remarkable first lady. And because of the, scandals with her husband and because of Watergate, was completely overlooked for all. But there's a new book that just came out about her called The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, which really shines a light. The other thing, if I could say, Judge, is the way her husband's advisors treated her. Very badly. Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, they completely were dismissive of Mrs. Nixon and how important she was to her husband's campaigning, to his politics, to here, she was working behind the scenes, helping to push the concept of having more women hired to the federal government. But the women's movement, never, ever accepted her. And so she was not given credit. And so she was taking the pressure from the outside and the inside, just really unfair.
So who do you believe was the most powerful First Lady?
Hands down, Edith Wilson, President Wilson's second wife. This is the most blatant example of extraordinary overreach of power. After his stroke in 1917, for 17 months, he did not see his cabinet. He saw his vice president only once. She formed such a protective cocoon around him that only her, his doctor, maybe his children, and the vice president one time would see him. She controlled the paper and everything that went in and out, what was signed by the president. She disputes this in her own memoirs, but it is hard to really accept that argument. Can you imagine in our world today, not seeing the president for 17 months? Yeah, so that, from that aspect, and not in a good way, it was power.
So it led to a change in the Constitution?
Yes, absolutely led to a change in the Constitution, now the 25th Amendment. Yes, which, if a president's incapacitated, there's a line of succession that we have in our country for continuity of operations and continuity of government. Think about this. This is not, and I'm very pro First Lady, otherwise why would I spend all this time writing 3 books? Now, even for kids, getting them to understand the power or the importance of the position, but that they are not the elected official, and they don't have any statutory authority. They are there as a partner to the presidency. Incidentally, I'm a big believer in that the position should not be paid, because I think the minute it's on the federal payroll, there are obligations and responsibilities that come with that eliminate what is the best part of this job, is the First Lady gets to pick and choose what she wants to work on.
So you worked for Laura Bush, you were chief of staff, and again, in our era, it's commonplace that a First Lady has a policy, has almost a political philosophy in some sense. So tell us kind of how that developed and how you feel about that.
Well, the one thing, this is where it's best for the president's spouse. They pick and choose issues to work on or initiatives to champion where they have some authenticity, credibility, some background knowledge, interest, passion. But the big question, too, is how does that support what the president's trying to accomplish? Let's remember, he's the one that's been elected. It's his initiatives and his vision for the country, someday her vision for the country, where the president's spouse can best help. The best way I can sort of describe this to you, too, is in my own interview with Laura Bush to be chief of staff, and this was the week after the re-election in 2004. I was already working for the president. I'd been there the whole 8 years, but I get the call to interview with her, and I remember, the first thing that she said, one of the first things she said, I'm not here for me. I'm here for George and because of George. What I choose to do should support what he's trying to accomplish. And she did that with education as her platform, being a former teacher, being a former librarian, having helped to lead education reform with him in the state of Texas. That's where her passion was. And so how that contributed, to the president's domestic initiative, first domestic initiative, which was, education reform, no child left behind. Mrs. Bush was a big proponent of that. So that was an example of how they take their own interests, but really marry it up with what the president's trying to accomplish. I can tell you from, working in the White House and having worked 3 different administrations, it is really does not work well when you're trying to run your own show that doesn't really marry up to what the president's trying to accomplish. It's just very difficult, and it's hard to get support amongst the president's staff, and and again, it's not what you're there for.
So in the book, you talk about some local connections.
Yeah.
Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball.
Oh, yeah.
And something that happened during the Eisenhower administration and what Mamie did. So tell us about that.
So this, during the period of time, of course, where Hollywood and a lot of actors in Hollywood and others, were being charged with un-American activities of being, communists. And so the Congress, of course, the Senate was having all these hearings, the House Un-American Activities hearings, and all of these, literati Hollywood elite are being dragged in front of the Congress, and Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were two of them. And this was, really the Eisenhowers knew them. And what Mrs. Eisenhower did was there was a party for President Eisenhower for his birthday at the White House. Big party, a lot of, attention, a lot of, press. And Mamie Eisenhower invites Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz to come to that party. Basically, the power of that image is we are supporting them, and we do not agree with what they were being dragged in front of Congress to do. The power of an image, really, that single invitation, made a big difference.
And as a sidelight, there's a number of those when African Americans were invited to the White House.
Yes, exactly. Lou Hoover was the first to invite the first African American congressman, Congressman DePriest. She invited his wife to a tea at the White House, and it was a huge blowback having invited this African American, to the White House. Here she's the spouse now of a member of Congress, and it just shows you where our nation was. So President Hoover, how he responded to that criticism of issuing this invitation to her to the White House, is he invited the heads of all the historically black colleges to come to a meeting at the White House. And again, showing how the president and first lady worked together to, push the nation forward a little bit through these power of these images, and really the courage to do that. Marian Anderson is another one being invited to, or the Daughters of American Revolution rescinded or refused to have her sing at the DAR, and then Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial by tens of thousands of people that watched her. I will say something that I didn't know, though, and again, I would say Eleanor Roosevelt helped to propel this. I just spoke at the DAR on Friday night. It was an extraordinary opportunity. And these are people who really are focused on our history and the telling of history. They really took that experience, which is a stain for them, and turned it around. They have had, Mary Anderson later came to sing at the DAR 3 different times. They have raised the money at the DAR, raised money, almost $500,000, to help restore her home, her childhood home in Philadelphia. They sponsor scholarships for the Marian Anderson Scholarship for for singing students. So again, this is the example. Maybe that was a mistake that they had made, but we have to focus on the evolution of people's thoughts too. And I like to think Eleanor Roosevelt helped to propel that.
So in the book, you have a quote, when it comes to women's health issues, history is divided into two periods. There's before Betty and after Betty. So tell us about that.
Incredible. Another local, first lady here in California. You have 3 first ladies. How lucky are you? But Betty Ford, really, this is a extraordinary figure in our history. Of course, she's first lady for 6 weeks. Discovers she has breast cancer. There's so much stigma associated with that, and people didn't say the word breast in public. Of course, women worried that their lives were over, she decides to go public with this and to help other women. And it is true. The people in the medical community will say that women's health is divided into these two timelines, before her and after her. And because she had the courage to speak out, and it helped so many women, and so many more women went for diagnoses and went for mammograms, and it changed the way women's health was administered in this country. And I think, one great example too, it didn't stop with her after she left the White House. She went public, of course, with her addictions to prescription drugs and to alcohol. And when the postage stamp was unveiled in her honor at the White House just last year, the new postage stamp that the Postmaster General released, and Dr. Biden presided over the ceremony. One of the speakers there was the head of the Betty Ford Hazelton Clinic, now a wonderful doctor, who spoke about how on the grounds of the Hazelton Clinic in Betty Ford's name, thousands of people who are working hard to get to their sobriety are walking the same grounds that Betty Ford did, and the courage that they take from that. That's an extraordinary legacy.
So the first ladies, as women, didn't always play a major role in the campaigns of their husbands for president. You have a couple of great quotes in there from slogans. One says, "I like Ike, but I love Mamie." The other one was, quote, "Vote for Betty's husband." So what kind of role do you think the first lady should play?
Yeah, again, listen, a candidate needs all the help they can get when they're running. And the spouse plays such an important role because it does sort of put a more of a human element on who they are as people, what they're like as husbands or fathers. And I think, when the first lady is popular, or the candidate spouse is popular, it's helpful. And you're right, Mamie Eisenhower's the first lady to actually have a campaign song written about them. And, through a lot of our history, first ladies were not active in the political realm, but Nellie Taft is an example of someone who so badly wanted to be first lady and remain as first lady, and her husband wasn't so crazy about being president, but she showed up at both nominating conventions, the Republican convention where he was seeking the nomination, and she sat in the front row at the Democratic convention so that her husband's opponent would not speak as ill of him. It's just incredible. You can't imagine that sort of happening now. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great campaigner. She was, politically very active, and she was driving people to the polls, even when her husband was running for governor of New York. So a lot of them have really stepped up. Pat Nixon was a great campaigner and really very involved in her husband's campaigns. Bess Truman, someone who gets overlooked. Back to your earlier question, it was her family's connections that made it possible for Harry Truman to even get his first elected office in statewide election in Missouri. So, they really have a valuable role to play.
So I want to talk about a quote from Barbara Bush.
Oh, sure.
And maybe you can set it up better than I, but she was speaking at Wellesley College, a commencement speech, all women's college. She wasn't their first choice, and a lot of people weren't happy that she spoke.
They weren't.
And so let me just read this part.
Sure.
As a good commencement speech does, this one issued a challenge to be the first to realize her dream, not society's dreams, her own personal dream. She followed that statement with one that brought the loudest response of the day, quote, "And who knows, somewhere out there in the audience may even be someone who will one day follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse, and I wish him well."
I know. She was ahead of her time. It's such a great line.
So
Backstory.
if that were to happen, how
Yeah.
will that change the role of
Well, here's the thing. I know Barbara Bush is so great. Listen, the position, we're big believers that the position adapts to its occupants, and the occupants will adapt to the position. Even currently, the current second gentleman says, when he's asked, what do you see is your most important role as a spouse of the vice president? He gives a very traditional response: to support the vice president. This is a gender-neutral response. They are there to support the elected official. He also has carved out an initiative that the administration has given him to work on, the anti-Semitism initiative, and he's continued to work outside the home. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School, not now during the campaign season, but presumably that's something he'll go back and do the way Dr. Biden has done, as she broke ground by working outside the home. But that speech, actually, if I can just say something, one chapter in the book is about the 4 speeches given by first ladies that are considered 4 of the top 100 rhetorical speeches of the 20th century. 2 by Eleanor Roosevelt, 1 by Hillary Clinton in Beijing on women's rights, and this one by Barbara Bush, because she turned around a negative situation. Those women did not want her to be the speaker, and she knew it. They wanted Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, and Barbara Bush starts out saying, I know you didn't want me. You wanted Alice Walker, known for The Color Purple. Instead, you got me, known for the color of my hair. And so she started that way and ended with that quote and completely turned it around. That's the power of rhetorical influence.
So I want to end,
Yes.
and I want you just to read a couple of paragraphs
Sure.
from your book, and that's how we'll end.
Sure.
Right there.
Oh,
Right there.
perfect. Okay. This is a chapter that we talk about first ladies who are charting their own course and things that they did that were stepping back from activism yet still having an impact. And this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mrs. Kennedy does this. It says, one fascinating revelation was Mrs. Kennedy's depiction of the early days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, before the world knew that the Cold War seemed to be sliding toward nuclear conflict. Mrs. Kennedy was at their weekend home in Virginia when the president called her to suggest she come back to the White House. She learned that the Soviets were installing missiles in Cuba aimed at American cities. The First Lady was prepared to die and begged her husband not to send her and the children away, preferring she and their children die with you than live without you. The Secret Service had well-established plans to protect the president, his family, and key members of the government in the event of an emergency, relocating to a bomb shelter on site or to an undisclosed off-site location would be determined by the nature of the threat. In his book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, Clint Hill, Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent, reports that Mrs. Kennedy was emphatic about what he could expect if the situation required her and the children to be relocated to a shelter. This is her quote. I will take Caroline and John, and we will walk hand in hand out onto the South grounds. We will stand there like brave soldiers and face the fate of every other American. Wow. It's pretty incredible. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful book.
Thank you.